On the night of July 25, 1956, the icon of Italian national pride was struck in the side by the SS Stockholm. The heavy Andrea Doria immediately began to list severely to starboard. Of all the ships in Italy at the time, the Andrea Doria was the biggest, fastest, and supposedly safest. During the strong tilt of the ship after the collision, half of the lifeboats were rendered useless. But the ship remained afloat for more than 10 hours since the collision. The prepared crew, along with improvements in communications, avoided a disaster similar in scale to that of the Titanic in 1912. How the ship with just over 200 m she remained afloat for over 10 hours. What happened that night was an accident, or a fatal miscalculation? Was there a major flaw in Andrea Doria's project? At just the right time. Andrea Doria's 51st West crossing to New York began like a typical North Atlantic race. On this crossing, the ship was 90% full of its total passenger capacity. 190 first class, 267 cabin class and 677 tourist class, with a crew of 572, a total of 1,706 people were on board. To know how Andrea Doria works, we need to know a little about its features. The Andrea Doria had a length of 212 meters, 697 feet, a width of 27 meters, 90 feet, and a record gross tonnage of 29,100. The propulsion system consisted of steam turbines coupled to two propellers, allowing the ship to reach a service speed of 23 knots, with a maximum speed of 26 knots. Andrea Doria departed Genoa at 11 a.m. on the first leg of her voyage. Her first stopover was in Cannes, on the French Riviera, where she arrived mid-afternoon that same day. Only a handful of passengers boarded there, 48 in all, 30 first class, 15 cabin and only 3 tourist class. Among them was one of Andrea Doria's most famous passengers, Hollywood actress Ruth Roman. Famous rock songwriter Mike Stoller was also on board. From Cannes, Andrea Doria then proceeded 400 nautical miles southeast towards Naples, where he arrived later the next morning to receive most of his passengers. A total of 744 came aboard in Naples, 85 in first class, 161 in second class and 498 in tourist class. Most of the tourist class were emigrants from impoverished regions of southern Italy on their way to new lives in America. The ship departed Naples shortly after 6 p.m. bound for its next stop, Gibraltar.
Com destino à sua próxima parada, Gibraltar.
Andrea Doria was neither the biggest nor the fastest ship of her time. These distinctions went to the RMS Queen Elizabeth and the SS United States, respectively. Instead, famous Italian architect Minnelli designed Andrea Doria for luxury. 2 days after she left Naples, the Andrea Doria finally arrives in Gibraltar for the boarding of her final 65 passengers, 26 first class, 19 second class, 20 tourist class. She headed for the Atlantic Open to New York. By navigating the southernmost routes in the Atlantic, Andrea Doria was the first ship to have 3 outdoor pools, one for each class, first, second and tourist class. When fully loaded, the ship was capable of accommodating 1,241 passengers in 3 different classes: 218 in first class, 320 in cabin class and 703 in tourist class, as was the rule on board passenger liners. Each passenger class was strictly separated for specific parts of the ship. First-class accommodations were located in the middle of the upper decks. Second-class accommodations were located near the stern. Tourist-class accommodations were split between the bow and stern ends and were connected by corridors running the entire length of the ship. Each class had its own public room. Dining room, lounges, social lounges, open and enclosed deck areas, and even their own pools with balconies. In addition, 563 crew members were tasked with operating and maintaining the ship. More than $1 million was spent on artwork to decorate the cabins and public rooms, including a life-size statue of Admiral Doria. On Wednesday, July 25th, Stockholm, a passenger liner, departed New York Harbor on its 103rd Atlantic crossing for its home port of Gothenburg, Sweden. At approximately half the size of Andrea Doria, Stockholm was the smallest passenger liner on the North Atlantic route during the 1950s. The ship was designed with a strong bow and icebreaker, due to its routes through the Arctic Ocean, which ended up being an important factor in its survival and causing fatal damage to Andrea Doria. Equipped with a double hull, the Andrea Doria was divided into 11 watertight compartments, of which only 2 could be flooded without endangering the safety of the ship. Andrea Doria also carried enough lifeboats to accommodate all passengers and crew. In addition, the ship was equipped with the latest early warning radar. However, despite its technological advantages, the ship had serious flaws related to seaworthiness and safety. After testing with a miniature model, the ship proved to be terribly unstable. This was even more apparent during her maiden voyage, when Andrea Doria banked 28 degrees after being hit by a large wave off Nantucket. The ship rocked even more dangerously when the fuel tanks were nearly empty, which usually happened at the end of a voyage. The watertight compartment bulkheads extended only to the top of Deck A, and a slope of more than 20 degrees allowed water from a flooded watertight compartment to pass over its top into adjacent compartments. In addition, the design parameters allowed the lifeboats to be lowered to a maximum inclination of 15 degrees. Beyond that limit, half of the lifeboats could not be lowered. Stockholm left New York almost full. It was commanded by Captain Harry Gunnar Nordenson, although Third Officer Johan Ernst Karstens Johansson was on duty on the bridge at the time of the accident. This was his first time alone on a ship's bridge, and he had been awake since 6 a.m. that morning. Stockholm was following its usual course south of the Nantucket lightship at a speed of 18 knots in clear skies. Intended to save time, Stockholm departed its route 20 miles north of the recommended course for ships departing the U.S., meaning the ship sailed straight for incoming traffic from the west. This was a clear violation of the 1953 North Atlantic Track Agreement, to which the company that owns the Stockholm was a signatory. As Stockholm and Andrea Doria approached, the Andrea Doria heading west had been traveling in heavy fog for hours. The captain slightly reduced the speed from 23.0 to 21.8 knots, activated the ship's fog warning whistle and closed the watertight doors. All the usual precautions to navigate in these conditions. However, Stockholm, to the east, had not yet entered what was apparently the edge of a fog bank. The North Atlantic waters south of Nantucket Island are often the site of a lot of fog as the cold Labrador current meets the Gulf Stream. As the two ships approached in low light, each was aware of the presence of the other ship, but guided only by radar, they apparently misinterpreted each other's course. No radio communication was made between the two ships at first. The original investigation established that in the critical minutes before the collision, Andrea Doria gradually turned to the left, attempting a pass from starboard to starboard, while Stockholm turned about 20 degrees to the right, an action intended to extend the passing distance of a door-to-door passage. In fact, they were heading towards each other. As a result of the extremely thick fog that enveloped Andrea Doria as the ships approached, the ships were quite close by the time visual contact was established. At this point, the crews realized they were on a collision course, but despite last-minute maneuvers, they were unable to avoid the collision. In the last moments before impact, Stockholm quickly turned to starboard and began to reverse her propellers, trying to stop. Andrea Doria, staying at her cruising speed of 22 knots when turning to port at the same time. As the ships were coming in opposite directions, the collision was inevitable. At around 11:10 p.m., the two ships tragically collide. As a result of the impact, 43 people aboard the Andrea Doria died instantly, crushed by the Stockholm's bow. The Andrea Doria swings violently. Passengers and ship objects are thrown to the ground. Screams are heard throughout the ship. Andrea Doria's routine trip had become a real nightmare. When the Andrea Doria and Stockholm collided at an angle of nearly 90 degrees, the sharp bow of the Stockholm icebreaker pierced the starboard side of the Andrea Doria, just below the ship's bridge. It penetrated 12 meters into the hull and keel. Below the waterline, 5 fuel tanks on the starboard side of the Andrea Doria were opened and filled with thousands of tons of seawater. Meanwhile, air was trapped in the other 5 empty tanks on the port side, causing them to float, contributing to a severe tilt. The ship's large fuel tanks were virtually empty at the time of the collision, as the ship was nearing the end of its voyage, worsening the tilt. The construction of the Andrea Doria began on February 9, 1950, with the ship's keel being laid on slipway No. A year and 4 months later, on June 16, 1951, Andrea Doria was released. During the ceremony, the hull of the ship was blessed by Giuseppe Siri, Cardinal Archbishop of Genoa, and baptized by Mrs. Giuseppina Saragat, wife of former Minister of Merchant Marine Giuseppe Saragat. During the ship's maiden voyage on January 14, 1953, she encountered severe storms on final approach to New York. Because of the waves, the ship reached inclinations of up to 28 degrees. On average, the Andrea Doria took 5 days to cross the Atlantic. It completed its maiden voyage on January 23, just a few minutes late. During her 51 crossings across the Atlantic, stability problems had always plagued the ship, and now it was further compounded by the collision. At the time of impact, the ship's watertight doors were closed, as it was part of a protocol to activate all the defenses of a ship when there is fog, given the high risk of collision. Andrea Doria is designed to handle slope, but not greater than 15 degrees. However, the combination of the 5 flooded tanks on one side and the 5 empty tanks on the other left the ship with a tilt that, a few minutes after the collision, exceeded 20 degrees. The collision only damaged one compartment of the Andrea Doria. However, the severe slope would gradually pull the tops of the bulkheads along the starboard side below the water level, allowing seawater to flow through the aisles, stairs, and otherwise to flood one by one the compartments that were intact. The collision had also punctured an access tunnel to a small generator room, located in the compartment just behind where the collision had taken place. Without a watertight door, the generator room was quickly flooded, contributing to the ship's loss of electricity. Initial radio distress calls were sent by each ship, and in this way they learned each other's identities. Soon after, messages were received by various radio and coast guard stations along the New England coast, and the world soon realized that two great ocean liners had collided. Andrea Doria sent this SOS call.
ICHSOS, questo è Andrea Doria SOS, qui alle 0320 GMT latitudine 40.30 N 69.53. Ho bisogno di assistenza immediata. Assistenza immediata.
Immediately after the collision, Andrea Doria began to be flooded and to tip severely to starboard. Within minutes, the tilt was at least 18 degrees. After the ship separated, Captain Calamai of the Andrea Doria quickly stopped the engines. As the slope increased, Calamai realized there was no hope for his ship unless the tilt could be corrected. In the engine room, engineers tried to pump water from the flooded starboard tanks, but to no avail. Aboard the Stockholm, about 10 meters of her bow were crushed and torn off. Initially, the ship was on a serious tilt towards the bow. To level the ship, the crew emptied the fresh water tanks that were on the bow of the ship. This caused the vessel to level out again. A quick inspection found that only one front compartment was damaged. Despite the damage, the ship was soon found to be stable and in no danger of sinking. On the Andrea Doria, the decision to abandon ship was taken 30 minutes after impact. By midnight, a sufficient number of lifeboats for all passengers and crew were positioned on each side of the boat's decks. Procedures called for lifeboats to be lowered along the deck promenade, one deck below, where evacuees could exit windows directly onto the boats, which would then be lowered out to sea. However, it was soon determined that half of the lifeboats could not be launched due to the severe tilt the ship was on. To make matters worse, the tilt also complicated normal lifeboat procedures on the starboard side. Instead of loading lifeboats on the side of the promenade deck and then lowering them into the water, it would be necessary to lower the empty lifeboats, and somehow take the evacuees from the outside of the ship to the water level for boarding. This was eventually accomplished by means of rope ladders. Afraid of causing panic and stampede from the starboard lifeboats, Captain Calamai decided not to give the order to abandon ship until help arrived. Meanwhile, Second Officer Guido Badano made announcements over the loudspeaker system instructing passengers to put on their life jackets and go to their designated muster stations. A distress message was relayed to other ships by radio, making it clear that additional lifeboats were urgently needed. The first ship to respond to Andrea Doria's distress call was the freighter Cape Ann. Upon receiving the message from Andrea Doria, Cape Ann immediately headed for the crash site. The assistance Cape Ann could offer was limited as it only had 2 lifeboats with a capacity of 40 people. Within minutes, she was joined by several other ships large and small that responded to the Andrea Doria's distress call.
Quarenta
44 miles east of the collision site, the French line's Ile de France was east of New York en route to its home port of Le Havre, France. The 30-year-old luxury liner was among the largest passenger liners in the North Atlantic. Upon learning of the collision and the distress call, Bodine wondered if a modern ship like Andrea Doria is sinking. He also knew that if he went to the crash site unnecessarily, it would mean having to return to New York to refuel and delay his passengers, which could be financial disaster for the French line. At the same time, he knew that if his help was needed, the French line would not question his actions in this case. Captain Bodine tried to contact Andrea Doria to find out more about the situation, but got no response. But after making contact with Stockholm and the ship Cape Ann, he quickly realized the gravity of the situation, and that the lives of more than 1,600 people were at risk. He quickly turned the Isle de France into a straight course for the Andrea Doria. Aboard the Andrea Doria, the launch of the 8 usable lifeboats to starboard was another calamity of the night, as many of the boats left the Andrea Doria partially loaded with around 200 panicked crew and very few passengers. While other ships in the vicinity were on their way, Captain Nordenson of the Stockholm, knowing that his ship was not in danger of sinking, sent some of her lifeboats to assist in the rescue of the Andrea Doria. In the early hours, many survivors were taken aboard Stockholm. Unlike the Titanic tragedy 44 years earlier, several other ships that heard Andrea Doria's SOS signal went as fast as they could. Andrea Doria's messages were relayed by other vessels, because the ship's radio range was very weak. The United States Coast Guard of New York City also coordinated the shore rescue. At about 3:30 in the morning, Captain de Bodine of the Isle de France became preoccupied with navigating his huge ship safely between the 2 damaged ships, along with small boats and boats that were transiting the site. By 4 a.m., the fog had dissipated and the ship Isle de France managed to dock safely near the Andrea Doria. The captain of the Isle de France ordered all external lights on the ship to be turned on. The sight of the illuminated Isle de France was a great emotional relief for many crew and passengers. The Isle de France managed to rescue most of the remaining passengers by transporting its 10 lifeboats to and from the Andrea Doria. Some passengers on the Isle de France have given up their cabins to make available to wet and tired survivors. Many other acts of kindness were reported by grateful survivors. In all, 1,663 passengers and crew were rescued from the Andrea Doria. The seriously damaged Stockholm received a total of 545 survivors, of whom 234 were crew members of the Andrea Doria. 129 survivors were rescued by Cape Ann, 159 by ship Private William H. Thomas, 77 by Edward H. Allen, including Captain Calamai and his officers. A very fortunate American sailor who slept through the entire collision and evacuation was lucky enough to be rescued from the ship. The Isle de France arguably played the biggest role in the rescue, having received a total of 753 survivors. At 5 a.m., most of the passengers and all the ships around watched the Andrea Doria slowly sink. At that moment, the ship's inclination was already approaching 40 degrees. Shortly after dawn, a 4-year-old Italian girl with head trauma and 4 seriously injured Stockholm crew were evacuated by helicopters sent by the Coast Guard and the U.S. Air Force. Several passengers and some crew were hospitalized upon arrival in New York.
O sol ilumina os convésios do
The sun
maravilhoso
illuminates
Andrea
the
Doria
decks of the
pela
wonderful Andrea Doria for the last
As
time.
únicas pessoas a
Now,
bordo
the
do
only
Andrea
people
Doria
aboard the
eram o
Andrea
Capitão
Doria
Calamai
were
e
Captain
seus 11
Calamai
membros da
and his
tripulação.
11 tribulation
Alguns
members.
destes, incluindo o
Some of
capitão,
these, including the
recusaram
captain,
firmemente
steadfastly
deixar a
refused to leave the
O
ship.
Capitão Calamai,
Andrea
no entanto,
Doria's Captain
cogitou a
Calamai
possibilidade
considered
de
the
revocar o
possibility of
navio
towing
para
the
águas
ship
rasas.
into shallow
No
water.
entanto, ficou
However,
claro
it was
que a
clear that the
embarcação estava
vessel was
condenada.
doomed.
Depois que todos os
After all
sobreviventes
survivors were
foram
transferred to
transferidos
rescue
para
ships,
resgate,
Andrea
a
Doria's
tripulação
remaining
restante do
crew
Andrea
began to
Doria começou a
disembark,
desembarcar,
forced to abandon
forçada
ship.
a abandonar o navio. Às 5 da
At
manhã,
5:30 in the morning, Italy's pride was abandoned.
às 6 horas da manhã,
At 6 a.m., Captain Calamai was on a rescue boat.
Às 9
At
horas e
9:45
40
a.m.,
minutos,
Andre
o
Doria
Andrea
breaks the
quebra o
silence of
silêncio
that
da
morning with
cabine,
creaks that
com
sound like a
registros que
farewell
mais
cry.
pareciam gritos de despedida. À medida que a embarcação
As the ship
rolava
rolled
para
to
esse
starboard,
ponto,
jets of
jatos
air
de
were
aéreo
expelled from the
expelidos
ship
pelo
as it
navio,
took
que
its
dava
last
seus
breaths.
últimos suspiros. Ao mesmo tempo,
At the same
membros da
time,
tripulação
crew
foram
members were
vistos
seen
jogando
throwing
chaves
keys
no mar.
into the sea.
Os marinheiros
Italian
italianos
sailors
eram
were
pessoas
people very
muito
attached to
ligadas
their
a seus
ships,
navios.
and seeing
E
a
ver
ship
o
like the
navio
Andrea
como o
Doria
Andrea
sink.
afundar
It was
foi algo
very,
muito,
very sad.
mas muito triste. As três
The
piscinas
three
foram
pools
vistas
were
sendo
seen filling with
preenchidas
water
com água
again at
novamente
10
às
a.m.,
10 da manhã,
and the Andrea
e o
Doria
Andrea Doria
dove into the
mergulhou
ocean.
nesse ano. À medida
As
que o
the
lado
port
de bordo
side dipped
mergulhava
beneath the
sob as
waves,
ondas, alguns
some of the
botes
unused
salva-vidas não
lifeboats broke
utilizados
free of their
se
davits
soltaram
and
de
floated
seus
upside
tubos e
down.
flutuaram de cabeça para baixo. O Andrea Doria finalmente afundou.
Andrea Doria
Às 10
finally
horas e
sank
10
10
minutos
hours
do dia
after the
26
collision,
de
at
julho
10:10
de
a.m. on July 26, 1956.
Por causa
Because of the division of the Andrea Doria's passengers and crew among the various rescue vessels, some families were separated during the collision and rescue.
não ficou
It
claro
was
quem
unclear
estava
who was
morto
where,
ou
or
se
whether or
algumas
not some
pessoas
people
sobreviveram ou
survived,
não,
until all
até que
ships with
todos
survivors
chegassem.
arrived in New York.
Ao todo,
In
6
all,
navios
6 different
diferentes
ships
participaram do
participated in the
resgate dos
rescue of
passageiros,
Andrea Doria's passengers and crew,
incluindo o
including the
forte
heavily
navio
damaged Stockholm,
que
which
conseguiu
managed to
voltar
make it
para
back to New York on its own with a United States Coast Guard escort.
Porém, eles
However,
chegaram
she
mais
arrived
tarde
later
que os
than the
outros
other
navios.
ships.
Durante a espera,
During the
o
wait,
comentarista
ABC
de
Radio
notícias
News
da
commentator
rádio
Edward
Edward
Morgan
Morgan
broadcast a
transmitiu
professional
relato
account of the
profissional da
collision,
colisão,
failing
não
to tell
dizendo
listeners that
ouvintes
his
que sua filha de
14-year-old
14
daughter
anos,
Linda Morgan was aboard the
estava a
Andrea
bordo do
Doria
Andrea
and was
Doria
dead.
e estava provavelmente morta. Mais
It was later
foi
revealed
revelado
that
que
Linda
Linda
had been
havia sido
thrown from her
jogada
bed
de
on the
socorro
Andrea
no
Doria
Andrea
on the
Doria
Stockholm's
para um
deck
convés
during
a
the
bordo de
collision,
Estocolmo
sustaining
durante a
moderate
colisão,
but not
sofrendo
life-threatening
apenas
injuries,
ferimentos
earning her the
moderados,
nickname
mas
Miracle
não
Girl.
correndo risco de vida. Ela ganhou o apelido de Garota Milagrosa. Na noite
The following
seguinte,
night,
depois
after
de
hearing
saber
the good
das
news,
boas notícias,
Edward
a
P.
transmissão
Morgan's emotional
emocionante de
broadcast
Edward
became one of radio's most
tornou-se uma das
memorable.
mais memoráveis da rádio. Entre os
Among the
passageiros do
passengers on the Andrea
estavam a
Doria were
atriz de
Hollywood
Hollywood
actress Ruth Roman and her
e seu
3-year-old
filho de
son
3
Richard.
anos, Richard. No filme
In the
Três Segredos
1950
de
film
uma
Three
Mãe
Secrets,
Morta,
Roman played a
interpretou uma
distraught
mãe
mother waiting to
perturbada
find out
esperando
whether or
saber
not her son had
se o seu
survived a
filho
plane
havia
crash.
sobrevivido ou não a acidente aéreo. Ela e seu
She and
filho
her son were
separados
separated
no
from
boat
each
durante a
other during the
colisão e
collision and
evacuação.
evacuation.
Resgatada,
Rescued, Roman had to wait to know the fate of her son, she waited worriedly and anxiously on the docks in New York for the safe arrival of her son aboard one of the rescue ships. Actress Betsy Drake, wife of movie star Cary Grant, also escaped the shipwreck, as did Philadelphia Mayor Richardson Dilworth. The New York pier to which Stockholm was headed was packed with photographers and television crews. All the major department stores and shoe stores had booths set up to give clothes and shoes to arriving survivors. The wreck affected automotive history as well, as it resulted in the loss of the Chrysler Norseman, an advanced and unique prototype car that had been built for Chrysler in Italy. The Norseman had been billed as a major attraction on the 1957 auto show circuit. However, it had not been shown to the public before the disaster and was lost, along with 50 other cars, in the basements of the Andrea Doria. In all, 6 first-class passengers lost their lives. In cabin 46, Colonel Walter Carlin was in the bathroom brushing his teeth at the time of the collision and miraculously survived, while his wife Jeanette was killed. Later aboard the Stockholm, crew members searching the wreckage of the mutilated bow spotted the remains of a woman matching Carlin's description housed in the wreckage, but before she could be retrieved, the wreckage collapsed and the body fell. As for the bodies of the victims, some of them were recovered during the shipwreck, identified and returned to family members for proper burial. The rest was lost at sea as they drifted away, sank or were inside the Andrea Doria and went down with her. Several months of hearings were held in New York City after the collision. Prominent maritime lawyers represented the 2 ship owners. Dozens of lawyers represented the victims and the victims' families. Both shipping lines contributed to a liquidation fund for the victims. Each company paid its own damages. For the owner of the Stockholm, damage was estimated at $2 million, half of which was for repairs to the ship's bow. Italian line suffered a larger loss, estimated at $30 million. Although heavy fog was given as the main cause of the accident, other factors were cited. 1. Andrea Doria's officers did not follow proper radar procedures, or did not calculate the course, speed and position of the other approaching ship. 2. Andrea Doria had not followed the rule that ships approaching head-to-head both turn to starboard. When Stockholm turned to starboard, Andrea Doria turned to port, closing the circle instead of opening it, making it impossible to avoid a collision. 3. Andrea Doria's captain Calamai was accelerating in a heavy fog. Navigation rules required speeds to be reduced during periods of limited visibility. 4. Although Andrea Doria had been shrouded in fog for several hours, Stockholm had recently entered the shore and was still adapting to the atmospheric conditions. The officer in charge of Stockholm believed the approaching ship was just a fishing boat and had no idea that she was a passenger liner and that she was speeding through the fog. 5. Andrea Doria's fuel tanks were almost empty and without seawater ballast to stabilize the ship, according to Italian line procedures. This contributed to the severe tilt after the collision, the inability of the crew to use the lifeboats for evacuation. 6. Also, the lack of a watertight door between the bulkheads near the engine room may have contributed to the ship's sinking. 7. Stockholm's navigation officer misinterpreted his radar. Due to a bad configuration on his radar, he thought he was further away from Andrea Doria than he actually was. He also failed to consult his captain, as required by regulation. Andrea Doria's collision with Stockholm led to several rule changes in the years after the incident. As this was essentially a radar-assisted collision event, in which excessive use was made of poorly handled technology, shipping lines were forced to improve training in the use of radar equipment. In addition, approaching ships were required to make radio contact with each other. To this day, there is no official culprit for who caused the accident. Both ships had attitudes that resulted in the disaster. Andrea Doria also had a sister ship, the SS Cristoforo Colombo, which had been released a year before the construction of Andrea Doria began. 3 years after the loss of Andrea Doria, a new ship, the Leonardo da Vinci, was built in 1960 for the Italian line as a replacement for the SS Andrea Doria. The Leonardo da Vinci became the last passenger ship of the Italian line to be used in service across the North Atlantic. After the Andrea Doria was sunk following a collision with the MS Stockholm in 1956, the Cristoforo Colombo stood alone until 1960, when the ship was joined by the Andrea Doria's replacement, SS Leonardo da Vinci. At the end of her cruise and transatlantic operations in 1978, the ship lay idle for months until a fire broke out on board on July 4, 1980. She burned for 4 days and capsized. Only in 1982 was it dismantled. Andrea Doria is less than 100 meters deep, and due to the luxurious facilities of the wreck, the ship has been a frequent target for divers. A week after the sinking of the Andrea Doria, divers Peter Gimbel and Joseph Fox managed to locate the wreckage of the ship and published photos of the sinking in Life magazine. Peter Gimbel later carried out a number of salvage operations on the ship, including the first-class bank vault salvage in 1981. Despite speculation that passengers had deposited many valuables, the safe opened on live television in 1984, but nothing valuable was found. With the ship's arrival in New York scheduled for the following morning, some passengers may have gone ahead and retrieved their valuables. Evelyn Bartram Dudas was the first woman to successfully dive the Andrea Doria. Dudas reached the wreck in June 1967. She and her future husband, John Dudas, recovered the ship's compass. As of 2010, the wreck has aged and deteriorated extensively, with the hull now collapsed. The upper decks collapsed to the bottom. As a result of this transformation, a large field of debris flows out of the ship's hull. Some once popular hotspots frequented by divers no longer exist. Divers call the Andrea Doria a noisy wreck, as it makes various noises due to continued deterioration and ocean currents moving broken metal inside the hull. A 2016 expedition to the Ocean Gate wreck revealed that Andrea Doria was rapidly deteriorating. In 2017, a rescue team recovered one of the ship's 2 foghorns. In July 2021, the restored foghorn was sounded at the Maritime Museum of New Jersey to commemorate the 65th anniversary of the sinking. Artifact recovery on Andrea Doria resulted in additional loss of life. At least 22 divers lost their lives diving into the wreck. Strong currents and heavy sediment that can reduce visibility to zero pose serious risks to diving at this location. There are thick fishing nets that cover the hull. An invisible web of thin fishing lines, which can snag diving gear, adds to the danger. The wreck site is nicknamed the Everest of wreck diving because of the number of deaths exploring the site. Stockholm's bow was rebuilt in New York at a cost of $1 million. In 1989, the former Stockholm was sold to Star Loro, the company that later became MSC Cruises. Today, Old Stockholm sails under the name Astoria and is registered in Portugal. She is the oldest ocean liner still in service and has undergone numerous renovations to conform to current shipping standards. Although it doesn't look quite like Stockholm in the 1950s, many elements are still original from the time, like the anchor and the windows of her hull. Disaster survivors continued their lives with a wide range of experiences. Captain Calamai never accepted the command of another vessel and lived the rest of his life shrouded in sadness. Most of the other officers returned to sea. Some survivors were mentally challenged for years after the incident, while others felt the experience helped them to value their lives. Several books have been written about Andrea Doria. Each presented information not contained in the others, providing varied perspectives. Numerous films were also created, most notably the 2002 horror film Ghost Ship. The film features the fictional Italian luxury liner Antonia Grazia, whose design was based on the Andrea Doria. The Stockholm may have taken the lives of 43 people at the time of the collision, but what happened on the Andrea Doria was practically a miracle, as the ship, even with very serious damage, remained afloat, giving enough time for the rescue of all your passengers. Andrea Doria may not be more famous than the Titanic, but this ship will surely stay in the memory of those who know her history.
Just the right time. I know that love can do it, take us all the way through it, till we all know how much we have to live for.
Thank you so much for watching this far. Subscribe to the channel so you don't miss new videos. My name is Marco Polo, narrator of the improvised channel for this English version.
At just the right time.